I remember it like yesterday, that fateful evening when I encountered an ambush on a desolate state route in rural North Carolina. It was a quiet night, or so I thought, as I patrolled the lonely stretches of Route 23, a north-south highway. I'd grown complacent over the years, accustomed to the tranquil routine of this rural corner of the world. But in the last several years, it had grown as a route for drug traffickers from Georgia to Tennessee. I had busted a driver transporting fentanyl on this route a month ago. So I knew its dangers, but I was about to face a terror that would shatter even that knowledge and capacity of that danger. The stars were scattered across the inky canvas of the sky, and the only sounds I could hear were the distant chirping of crickets and the gentle hum of my patrol car. I was the lone officer assigned to this stretch, responsible for keeping the peace in this forgotten corner of the state. My heart never raced as I cruised the dark lanes, passing fields of corn and tobacco that stretched around the state's foothills of the Appalachia Mountains. As I rounded a bend, I noticed a car pulled haphazardly along the road, half blocking the two-lane route north. My instincts kicked in. Seeing any activity out here at this hour was unusual. I pulled over with my lights on as I approached the vehicle and exited the cruiser. As I got closer, I noticed the driver's side door was wide open and the interior light was on. The car was idling with the keys in the ignition, but no one was in the car and no one appeared around the car. My gut told me something was wrong, but I didn't know what. I held my flashlight up, fingered my Glock in its holster and called, "Police, anyone there? Do you need assistance?" I cautiously reached for my radio, calling for backup. Still, before I could complete the call to dispatch, the silence was shattered by the deafening sound of gunfire. Bullets whizzed by me, cracking the windshield and puncturing the metal of my car. Panic surged through my veins as I dived into the ditch beside the road and crawled behind the car for cover, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I could see shadowy figures moving around the idling car on the road in the dim light. I tried to assess the situation as best as possible, my training kicking in. It was clear this was an ambush, and I was the target. I frantically radioed for backup, praying for the cavalry to arrive in time. The exchange of gunfire continued, a hellish symphony of chaos that seemed to stretch for eternity. I could hear the metallic clang of bullets striking the patrol car, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. My mind raced, and I could feel fear clawing at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to overwhelm me. I took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, returned fire, aiming for the shadowy figures behind the other vehicle. The moon provided only sporadic illumination, making it impossible to discern my attackers. I fired blindly, trying to suppress my panic as I heard the distant wail of sirens, my salvation drawing nearer with each passing moment. I heard shouts from the other side of the road and the unmistakable sound of a car engine roaring to life. The attackers were making their escape. I knew I had to act quickly, so I darted from behind my bullet-riddled car and gave chase on foot. My heart pounded as I ran, desperate to apprehend those who had just tried to take my life. As I closed the gap, I could see the taillights of the fleeing car ahead, their red glow taunting me. I screamed at the perpetrators to stop, warning them that backup was coming, but my words were lost in the night. Suddenly, the car swerved to a stop, its brake lights casting a blood-red glow across the road. Panic surged through me as I realized the ambush was far from over. The car's occupants had come to a sudden halt, and I had no idea what they had in store for me. Before I could react, the car's headlights blazed to life, temporarily blinding me. I heard the squeal of tires and the deafening roar of the engine as it accelerated toward me. In that heart-stopping moment, I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding being struck. The car sped past, the rush of air tugging at my uniform. As I scrambled to my feet, I watched in horror as the vehicle careened off the road, crashing into a tree with a bone-jarring impact. The sirens grew closer, and I knew I had to secure the scene before backup arrived. Breathing heavily, I approached the wrecked car, drawing my weapon and ordering the occupants to exit. Two individuals stumbled out, disoriented and dazed. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins as I handcuffed them and secured their firearms. Backup finally arrived, and the situation was brought under control. The attackers were apprehended and taken into custody. They were clearly hardened criminals, not local hoodlums. This wasn't their first time ambushing cops. As I stood there, the shattered patrol car and the tangled wreck of the assailant's vehicle as stark reminders of the chaos that had unfolded, I realized how close I had come to losing my life that night to those hired killers. In the days that followed, the investigation would reveal that the ambush was a targeted attack due to my arrest of the fentanyl mule the month earlier. The assailants were hired assassins of a dangerous drug cartel to teach me and all highway patrol officers a lesson about who owned the roads. My dedication to upholding the law had put me in their crosshairs. That night, on that desolate stretch of Route 23, I faced the darkness head-on and survived. It was a chilling nightmare and a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. It also renewed my resolve to protect the peace and safety of our families and children from the scourge of this awful drug and the criminal element that controls it. I would continue to patrol those lonely lanes, but from that night forward, I would never take the silence for granted again. So we get a call to do a welfare check on an elderly shut-in. It's a routine call we get at all times of the year. My partner, Officer Barnes, and I responded. It was a boiling hot afternoon in Midland, Texas, and the sun mercilessly beat down on the city. We had been dispatched to a rundown apartment building in response to a concerned call from a woman who hadn't heard from her mother for days. I had a premonition of something terribly wrong as we approached the building. Welfare checks weren't uncommon in our line of work, but something about this one sent shivers down my spine. The rundown building, decaying neighborhood, or the sweltering heat surrounded it. We knocked on the apartment door, and when there was no answer, we enlisted the help of the building superintendent to unlock the door. The first sign that the occupant was home but unable to answer became apparent as we pushed the door open. The chain was still in place, preventing us from fully entering. I called again, police welfare check. Is anyone home? The second sign was the overwhelming stench that hit us like a physical force. It was a putrid, sickening odor that comes from something long dead. The stink told us there was something in there and was rotting. I pushed in the door with my body weight, breaking the chain lock. The apartment was dark and none of the lights worked. I pulled out my flashlight and entered. We moved cautiously through the darkness, our flashlights illuminating the path through the clutter of a hoarder. We found her on the couch, a frail figure shrouded in shadows, sitting alone, isolated in the darkness of the closed room without ventilation. Her face was gaunt and her skin pallid. She sat there, her tongue hanging out of her mouth grotesquely, her eyes vacant. The beginning stages of decomposition were evident. She was alive, but it was clear that she was beyond help. The stench was overpowering, and I felt a wave of nausea. At that moment, we couldn't fathom what we were seeing. We were cops and had seen our fair share of gruesome scenes, but this was something out of a horror movie. We sealed off the apartment and radioed for paramedics to take her to the hospital for a more dignified death. As we retreated to wait for the ambulance, the lady on the couch suddenly moved. She raised a bony hand to her eyes in a slow, deliberate manner reminiscent of a zombie in a movie. A strangled, gurgling sound escaped her lips. My partner and I froze, our flashlights fixed on the bizarre and macabre sight. "Help," she moaned, the sound almost otherworldly, like something from a nightmare. We didn't waste a second. Fear and adrenaline propelled us as we bolted out of the apartment, leaving the superintendent's face a mask of confusion and terror. The living dead, or something eerily similar, was in there, beyond our comprehension. We reached the hallway, and the superintendent was nowhere in sight. He had likely retreated to the safety of his own apartment. We didn't blame him. At that moment, our instincts told us to get as far away from that scene as possible. As we descended the stairs, our rational minds finally began to process what had just occurred. We were trained police officers, not characters in a horror story. If that was a threat, it was a threat we could handle. We exchanged glances and nodded. We had a duty to fulfill. Reluctantly, we made our way back to the apartment. This time, we were prepared for whatever waited inside. I clicked on my flashlight, and Barnes did the same. Our flashlights pierced the darkness, and the eerie moans grew louder as we entered the apartment. What we found was far from the supernatural. The lady on the couch was a frail, elderly woman with a stroke. The strange movements, the hand to her eyes, the vocalizations were remnants of her brain attempting to respond to stimuli. We radioed an ambulance to hurry, hoping she could receive the medical attention she so desperately needed. But as we stood there, watching the paramedics rush her out of the building, she was clearly stepping through death's door. Her frail, bony hand reached out as if reaching for a lifeline now out of reach. We visited her in the hospital the next day before our shift. The stroke had left her in a vegetative state, and her prognosis was a few hours of life. It was a heart-wrenching reminder that sometimes the calls we responded to were not about crime and danger, but about the vulnerable and the desperate. With its eerie chain on the door and the overpowering stench of death, that welfare check would forever remain etched in my memory. It was a vivid reminder of the unpredictable and often heartbreaking nature of our work as police officers. I've been a police officer in a quiet coastal town in Maine for the past decade. This job isn't about the money, it's about knowing you're making a difference in your community. Our little town, Lincolnville, is nestled right along the rocky shores of the Atlantic, and it's home to just about 2,500 residents. It's known for its tranquility and safety, a place where you'd hardly ever expect anything out of the ordinary. The most excitement we usually get is burglary or domestic disturbance. But as they say, you never know what tomorrow will bring, and that saying became all too real one spring in 2021. It was one of those eeriest and most inexplicable calls I've ever had the misfortune of responding to. I was on my usual patrol when the call came in, reporting screams from the beach. It was unusual because we rarely received calls from the beachfront. It was probably a swimmer sighting a shark. We often had to close the beach this time of year due to the frequent shark activity, so I sped over to the beach area. When I arrived, I was met with a crowd of beachgoers, all filming and pointing at something in the water. I walked up to them, and from a distance, it looked like a small buoy drifting in the waves. However, as it drew closer, it dawned on me that it was the head of an unconscious person. As the waves pushed the body ashore, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread and confusion. It was the unconscious body of a man in his early 20s, dressed in cargo pants and a leather jacket. There was no blood or signs of hypothermia. It appeared as if he had been in the water for only a few minutes. We dragged the man out of the water onto the beach, and I began performing CPR in a desperate attempt to revive him, but there was no pulse. A rescue unit arrived within minutes. I looked in his pocket for any identification, and here's when things took a bizarre turn. In one of his jacket pockets, I found a small Ziploc bag containing a folded piece of paper with an odd arrangement of letters and symbols, like some cryptic code. We couldn't understand it, but we believed it might hold clues. The beach had to be closed, and a curfew was enforced on that section of Lincolnville to allow forensics to determine if it was a murder scene. The man's body was sent to Portland, and an autopsy was conducted, but it couldn't determine the cause of death. The coroner eventually attributed it to natural causes related to the ocean. Still, the mystery of where he came from and how he died and got into the water persisted. Rumors began to circulate in the town. Some believed he had drowned, while others thought he was a victim of foul play, even suggesting he was a spy dropped off by a submarine. But no raft was ever recovered. The whispers of a serial killer living near Lincolnville began to circulate. Some connected this case to the unsolved Lady of the Dunes case from the 70s, though there was no evidence of a link between the Provincetown murder and this case. Forensic experts attempted to decipher the code without success, even with advanced computer programs. Homeland Security took a particular interest in this man with no identity. It's been several years and I still can't shake the questions that haunt me. How did he die? Why the encoded cipher? What secrets might it have held? The answers elude us today, and the case continues to create speculation and rumors.
Subscribe.